Look at this. I know you have seen hard-coded username, password, and security tokens in integration middlewares before. Very bad practice. We need to get away from doing this. If somebody changes the password, security token, your integration breaks. It'll look like this down here, invalid username, password, all of that stuff. And let's not even get started on the user getting locked out if this is tied to a specific user and not an integration user. And of course, I've got to give a shout out to Heroku, who's the sponsor of this video, and they let me try out AppLink early. Heroku is one of the best places for developers to build, deploy, and scale their applications. Then if a bad actor gets access to these values, they'll be able to log into your Salesforce org, bring down all of your data. It is a nightmare. When we're building out middlewares like this, either using Salesforce or some other sort of connector, we need to make sure that we are connecting securely and storing our values in the appropriate places. We'll be taking this not super secure Node.js middleware and using Heroku AppLink to securely authenticate to our Salesforce org so that we can do all of our deployments and object creations and all of that stuff in a better way. Have you ever seen an application like this in production? All it does is take requests from one system and send them into Salesforce. For example, we've got this local endpoint here, webhook/GitHub. And the body here is just information from GitHub repositories like the sender, maybe it was a commit or something like that. So we send it out. And what we'll see is that it took this message and inserted it into Salesforce. So let's jump into Salesforce, refresh, and here is that request that we have. So this application is called a middleware, and ideally all it does is it takes requests from one system. Potentially those systems don't have a way of authenticating into Salesforce, and we know that Salesforce needs an authenticated user to run a lot of its processes. So webhook from GitHub or Stripe, it takes it, adds in that authentication layer, and we can see it over here. We're using username and password to authenticate, which is part of the problem and why I'm talking about this, but we authenticate and then we are able to insert our records. So this is using a Node.js application and a library called Salesforce, very popular here, but there are some issues with this because we're authenticating pretty poorly. I've seen lots of different integrations like this where they just use username, password, and security token, and you have a .env file with the hard-coded credentials that are ripe for the picking for hackers or just somebody making a mistake and deploying the .env file into your GitHub repository. So there are better ways of doing this, but you have to kind of watch out and adhere to all of these different pieces in here. And a lot of times companies are very conscious of the cost piece, right? Because there are middleware solutions that are out there, things like MuleSoft and Jitterbit are ones that I've heard and used of in the past, but they cost potentially an arm and a leg to use these products, and you need to train somebody else on how to deal with them. So Heroku has recently released their AppLink. It is in pilot, but I've got access to it, and hopefully by this, it'll be in GA, and you'll be able to test this out. And what this does is apps that are deployed on Heroku are allowed to very easily and seamlessly connect to Salesforce without needing to put in your username and password like we saw before. So we will walk through this middleware use case inside of Heroku AppLink, installing it, getting our app deployed, and test it out on Heroku in this video. So let's get started. We saw this working in the kind of poor way that it's being done here with the Salesforce implementation. So now let's go ahead and update this by installing the Heroku AppLink and adding that add-on to our Heroku app. Let me open up a new terminal here, and I'm just going to copy and paste that command that we were seeing just a second ago for installing the Heroku AppLink plugin inside our project. So this looks good and it went through successfully. Now that we've got it installed, we need to connect our application with the AppLink or the integrations. So my Heroku app is called Mysterious Badlands. So let's go ahead and do this. And I may have an error in here. Oh, we can see some of the connections that I have in here before. But if you're doing this for the first time, you may need to run this command here, which is just setting up the add-on to my specific org that I'm running. But one of the cool things, we can kind of see it here, you can have multiple connections related to Heroku. So here we want to do Heroku add-ons create, the Heroku integration, and then the Mysterious Badlands, that specific app that I am working with. It's giving me an error saying that it is already configured, and that is totally fine. Now we need to create a new connection because I've got a couple inside of here already. And let's see what we've got for our CLI commands. We see there's this Heroku Salesforce Connect over here. And generally, this is the setup that we are looking for, right? So we're going to connect the specific org. And the fun part is that it's going to just pop a username and password. So we've got, let's see if I can copy this, copy here. And then for the name, you can name it whatever you want, but I think this is a trial. And then org farm org. From here, we can press any key and that will pop our browser to actually log into the org. Let me get logged in here. And this is what we are looking for, right? It has successfully processed. And then over here, it is connecting. And now we have another org that we can use. And just like before, let's take a look at all of the integrations that are potentially connected to my org farm org. We can see all of the connections here, and some of them did fail. If your connection does fail, there's a few things that you can check. Make sure that you actually have the Heroku feature enabled inside of your org, either create a scratch org that has this enabled, or you can go ahead and request a trial org with this enabled. From here, we're seeing that my run as user is not set. If you're seeing this as null, then your integration may not be hooked up 100%. I would recommend that you run an additional flag on the connection that you use. It is store.as run as user, right? So this is making sure that we are selecting or saving that run as user, and it is in the documentation here as well. So I'm just going to run this again. Oh, we've got the existing name in here. So I'm just going to do org farm 2. So that we've got a new name, and there is a way to disconnect from all of those as well so that we don't clutter them up. But I wanted to show you all that just in case you were seeing that value in there or that specific error on your screen. So now we're connected. From here, we need to configure our Heroku environment variables. So this is as simple as saying Heroku config set, and then I like to do sf_org, and then the name of the org that you are selecting in here. So as soon as I press enter, this is going to shoot up into my Heroku and be added in there. From here, we need to pull back the environment variables and add it to our local env if we wanted to run this locally. Ideally, you shouldn't be sharing this info, but I'll share it with you all because it's for video and it's fun to learn. So I'm copying these different variables down here. The ones that we really need are the Heroku integration ones and this _org. So I copied a few of those. I'm going to say Heroku settings and then paste those in. Let's clear some of this stuff up, right? But the key here is that this trial org, this SF org ID is now an environment variable. And then we can use this inside of our org instead of using the username and passwords that exist inside of our config. I think that's all the setup we needed to do. Relatively simple, did a few installs, and then logged in and connected to our Salesforce org, and now we are ready to rock. So from here, we need to actually update the code to not use this JS force over here, but to be able to use our Heroku connection. So there's one more install that we need to do. It's going to be an NPM package called the Salesforce Heroku SDK for Node.js. We can see it over here, and it's actually a work in progress. So there's not a lot of documentation on it, but that's where the power of AI comes in, because once we install it, we can use AI to create some documentation for us, which technically I've already done. But I'm going to do pnpm install and then do that at Heroku /Salesforce-SDK-node, right? So we're going to run that off and we can see that I've already got it, but go ahead and install that inside of your org. And then the node modules will exist inside of here for that at Heroku. This is where the SDK lives. There's a ton of different things inside of here. And for the most part, you don't really need to understand it. I'm sure as they continue to build it out, there will be some additional documentation. But what I did was use a tool like Cursor, and I referenced the documentation node. So I brought it over like this and I said, can you create documentation on how to use this node module, right? And then it will go through and create documentation for it, just like this MD file that I have right here. And it's pretty straightforward. It's a package where we need to have that inside of our node application, initialize the SDK, set up our org. Now, this is the fun part over here. We've got our org that we want to set up. And then there is this data API where we can do any of the operations that we actually care about. It gives you examples on how to create records using that data API and query records and all of that stuff. All of this got generated based on the information that was provided inside of the package. So with that in mind, what we're able to do from here is use that documentation and a tool like Cursor to update our Salesforce.js to make sure that it is using the latest way of processing using the app link. So I'm going to come in here and say what I want changed. Update the Salesforce.js to use the Heroku Salesforce SDK. I have an environment variable called sf_org that should be used. And then I'll just clean this up because I knew that underscore wasn't going to come through, right? So we're going to send this off. Oh, we need to add context for our Salesforce.js and run that through. And what's really nice is you don't need to be an expert in either the Heroku Node.js SDK or how to run these middlewares, but you can use AI to help configure these things and set them up as you're testing them out and running it through. So it looks like the changes are done. We've got our Heroku SDK coming through here. I'll close this panel out. We've got our Heroku SDK in here. There's a constructor for a few different values, and then we're initializing it, right? So making sure to use the Salesforce SDK.init, putting that in a value or a variable so that we can use it later. Then we are using this, and all of this I got from the documentation as we're reading it. So setting that connection, and the key here, I think this is spelled wrong, Salesforce org. These are all capitalized, right? You got to make sure to watch your AI as you're processing it. You want it to be the same exact things for your environment variables here. Then once we have that Heroku integration connection, we are setting the API data, that data API, which can interact with a lot of different things. Once that's done, I think it's just a matter of creating and setting the objects correctly. So we can see that we are now using this .data API instead of JSForce, right? There's a disconnect for everything and all of that looks good. All right, we've got that branch deployed, and now it's time to actually test this out. So I'm going to restart my server because I changed my environment variables. And I should be able to jump into my localhost port 3000, hit run, still successful over here. And then we are seeing once again that this has run successfully. Jumping back into my Salesforce org, we should see a new one, right? Only 15 minutes later to get this update. And here we are with the new or that same value that has come through. So this is working really well. And as you can imagine, it's very easy to just update, right? To do a Stripe integration and just write that specific code for Stripe. This might actually break, right? Invalid signature. But do other integration endpoints as you are processing it down. The final thing that we want to do is to get this deployed up to Heroku so that we can actually see the changes being processed in an actual org. So it is as simple as doing like Heroku up to send it up there, but there is this new Heroku extension that makes it very easy to do deployments and push the latest code to your Heroku instance. So all we need to do once your code is set up is do this deploy over here, and then it's going to start running through the process of deploying your code that you have to Heroku. While this is deploying, there's some really just like fun things that you can think about how this works. we can potentially have multiple .envs depending on the environment type that we are in. So imagine you have an org that you're testing against for production versus the testing, right? Or your integration test. So you can set that up with the envs inside of your actual application, which is really nice. And what makes this really nice is all the security aspect is held inside of Heroku. Let's jump over into my Heroku. Here's my mysterious Badlands. And we can see that we just did a deployment here. We can even open up the app and we won't see anything because it's just an empty route, right? This is only an application to post data to and send them back. But we can see that the deployment went through. We've got our Heroku integration all set up, and even nicely, we could see any of the metrics related to it. Let's make sure that everything is actually working together. So I've got this GitHub repo that has a webhook already hooked up to it. And when I push, it should be sending it to that webhook. So I'm going to go ahead and send it out here, and that webhook should start to process. We'll see potentially some activity over here, but the real kicker is that inside of Salesforce, we should see that update come through, and it's already sent through. Here it is. All of that data and the different values that I had inside of that repo, along with additional information. This is an even more secure way of creating this type of middleware. Now we no longer have that username and password inside of our middleware. It's all contained inside of Heroku, and we are being very security conscious and even cost effective when we think about running this type of Node.js application on Heroku versus paying an exorbitant amount for some sort of pre-existing webhook application. So I think that's it. I recommend that you check out the Heroku app link trial. You can see that the code is very simple in here on how you can connect to an org and then even create records, deploy things, delete things as you are building out your applications. It's super easy to sign up for AppLink. Just go to this link here. There's a ton of other things that I did not cover that are included in Heroku AppLink and eventing. Definitely check out some of their documentation so that you can understand what's in there and if there's a use case that really works for your organization. You won't have to worry about those other middlewares or having your environment variables leaked in any certain places. As always, there's going to be links down below for the GitHub repo that I have here, along with the documentation that is related to Heroku AppLink. Thanks so much to the Heroku team for sponsoring this video. Super fun to get to work on this sort of project and something that people will use all the time. One of the more tedious parts of this application was actually building out all of the data structure inside of Salesforce. I'm a dev, so I just want to drop in the configuration like this and have it automatically get created. And I actually used a tool recently called Sierra AI that can use AI and natural language to generate Salesforce configuration. So if you're curious about that, check out this next video that I have for you here. As always, I'm Walters954. Thanks so much for watching, and I believe in you.